So here's the camera body, here's the front of the camera, the shutter assembly on it. We have to get the two parts mated up. So what needs to be done? Well, first thing that needs to be done is to get the cam back in position. This one I've just lubricated up. So the cam surface here and here I've lubricated with some molybdenum paste. I've used synthetic grease on the gear at the back. This just slips into the camera there, and the angle that that thing wants to be sitting on is quite important. Just sitting in at that angle. You can see it there, you can see the direction it's pointing. Now then the front cam goes on. Likewise the cam surface here, I've lubricated that with some molybdenum paste. And we just release that mirror and that enable me to get this in. Now this has got to be tensioned. You can see the spring here. This has to be tensioned about 1.5 turns. So you need some way of holding that spring in position. So the way I do it is I've got this little bracket made. You can see it's just folded from a piece of sheet metal. It's got a little tab on the side there bent out to catch the spring. This works very well for me, and I'll demonstrate how this goes, and then I'll show you an alternative and somewhat more cumbersome method. So this goes on here, held in place with a single screw. That screw needs to be quite short, because if you use a long screw in that position it will foul the cam and you won't be able to get things to work properly. Okay, so at this stage I've got the cams in position. I want to tension the spring up. So as I said, that spring needs to be tensioned about 1.5 turns. I've got a tool to do that here. The slot will catch that spring. It runs over the end of the cam and allows me to tension that spring. So there's no tension at all at that point. At that point I'm starting to get tension. I'm coming round another full turn, and I'll make sure that end of that spring gets caught by that bracket. I'm holding down the cam with my tweezers so it doesn't lift off with the tool, and there I have that cam in position, tensioned about 1.5 turns, and everything should be hopefully go quite smoothly. Then we have the washers. These are the spacer washers that go on the body, and what I've found useful is that if you sort through your washers you'll probably find that some of them are pretty much dead flat. In other words, they haven't retained their springiness. I find it useful to sort out the 4 flattest washers and put them in position first, one in each position. Then I'll put that washer on. These are saucer shaped, so it's concave side up. And then the other 4 washers, convex side up. Alright, so at this stage the capping plate is locked down into position. The mirror is in the up position. The film advance is not in the cocked position, and the shutter is also not in the cocked position. Now we just have to get everything together. This arm on the shutter has to drop into this space here. The wheel for our meter drops into this space here and will couple with this wheel. At the top here you can see our pinion here will drop in here and couple with this little pinion here. This tab will come in on top of this button here on that screw on top of the film release. The meter is set, the meter drum is set in the neutral position. That's with the notch on the drum at the top here towards the front of the camera. And if everything goes smoothly and we don't drop anything, this should go together. So I'm getting that lever in the right position, lowering this down gently. Now all of those washer stacks are just sitting there, so don't start shaking the camera around. If I put my tweezers under there and just lift that chrome trim, the next thing I've got to do is to press the mirror. So I'm pressing on the bracket beside the mirror so it'll drop down. Now this isn't dropping into position. I think that the drum down here is not sitting correctly. Let me give this a wriggle. That's better. Or it might have been the shutter release. So I'm back where I was. To press the mirror should drop down and then the front of the camera should drop in. Now the mirror is not trapped, it's tucked down below the shelf here. There are 4 screws. Use 2 of the original screws in the lower position, and you just want to get that thread started. That's to stop the washers being able to get away, and it's quite easy to use the original screws for doing that. In the upper position we're a bit further away. I use 2 of the screws that are designed for doing the film advance lever. And if I've got 2 here, I'll demonstrate that. Okay. Alright, get one there, hopefully it'll go through the washers. Just start that and no more. The same over here. Right, we're on the right track. Now I can tip the camera back up. The shaft here, the cam, is pushed this way by the tension of the spring. I need to push it back inwards and it should, with a bit of luck, drop into the hole on that front plate. Yeah, I just heard it drop in. So now I'm just looking at the position of my front plate. It's sitting fairly well. It's not sitting quite back in position. It probably means that the tooth on the transfer shaft at the front is not completely engaged with the little pinion. So press the release down, that'll free up the mechanism. And as soon as you touch the film advance, I just touched that film advance and I felt that tooth drop into place. So at that stage I'll just nip up those 2 lower screws very lightly, and this screw at the top, pull that long one out. That was just to guide things into position for us. Get the proper screw for that position there, and run that down just very lightly. You don't need to worry about this one, there's really not an awful lot happening over there, so that doesn't matter. Now at this stage, if everything's good, the shutter will cock. But we might be one tooth out, I just don't know yet. So I'm just going to move the film advance, watch the action, and be mindful that if the film advance won't advance, it means that you've got something one tooth out, and if you force it, it'll break. So I'm just checking. That film advance worked normally, got to the end of its stroke and return. This I'll set to about half a second. Let's see what happens. That went very well. So basically, that's the front back in position. That's all working well. The next check I'd want to make is to make sure that the self-timer works, because if the timing is not quite right, you'll get to a stage where the self-timer won't start. So I'll cock the shutter, hold in this tab on the side here, cock this self-timer and see what happens. Yeah, the shutter blades are all closed, everything's ready to make the exposure. And there's our exposure. So that is how you get the front on when everything goes nice and smoothly and you've got everything working to your advantage. And what I mean by that is that the little bracket I made at the top here is very convenient to use, and this tool is very convenient to use for cocking that spring. You can get by without those things, or without one of them, but it's a struggle. I can demonstrate how that's done, because if you're only ever doing one of these, you may be prepared to struggle and do the job 3 or 4 times until you get it right, rather than invest the time into making the tools. I'll remove this front and I'll demonstrate the poor man's way of dealing with it. Okay, so everything's where we left it. The cam is untensioned here at the front. There's nothing holding it in place, and we want a cheap alternative. Well, the cheap alternative is to make a little bracket like this, and that just goes on there. I've got a hole in there for the screw to go through. Again, it's the same deal. You don't want a screw that's very long because it will foul the cam, and if it fouls the cam, you are going to have a bad time of it. Now let's find a screw here that'll do the job. Oh, that one, no, that's probably not quite big enough here. Let's just get another one. Where's the one I used on the other job? Oh, that one. Yeah, that'll do. We'll get that screw in there. So, that little bracket, what's its functioning bits and pieces, the pieces we desperately need? Well, its main feature that we desperately need is this little notch right here, which is going to catch the spring for us, hopefully. Where did I get that piece of metal to make that from? Well, I got it from one of these. And what's one of these? Well, one of these is the cover for the back catch that I've stolen off the parts body. In that case, it could have come from anything, I can't remember which one it came from. This is one that I've just recovered from a really dead 3C. But basically I just took a piece of that, and its big advantage is it's got a nice 90-degree edge there, which runs over the edge of the body tidily so that the bracket doesn't flap about. And I had to drill one hole in it so I could get a screw in to the equivalent of this position, and that will allow me to catch the end of that spring. So in this case we're acting as though we haven't got a useful device like this. And what did I used to do before I made a useful device like that was basically I fought it into place with a pair of tweezers, a pair of very stiff tweezers. I'll see if I can find the tweezers I used to fight with on this job. It would have been this pair. Okay, so I want to get the tension on that spring, so I've got to pick up the end of the spring. This is without disturbing the cam. I've just got that sitting there now. I can tell that it's under tension, but I need another full turn from there. I have to grab that spring with my tweezers and rotate it another full turn. Now I'm just transferring that to my thumb so I can catch it again. And I rotate this. No, the cam's popped out of position, so I've got to start again. So let me just get this in position, make sure that my rear cam is seated correctly. It's seated at the right angle, and the right angle is like that. Put the front cam back in place. Of course the mirror will pop up very shortly. That's okay. The front cam's in place, it's rotated fully clockwise. I've got to get the spring and rotate it about 1.5 turns from where it currently is. See, I told you that would pop back up. So that's just tensioned and no more. I need a full turn from there. Okay, it's sitting there. It's under tension. It's like a ticking time bomb. It's also pushed well out of line, but that'll probably do. So let's stack the washers back on the body. And see if I can get this assembled. Now you might think that the fight's over because we have the spring tensioned and it's all in a good place, but unfortunately it's not as simple as that. The spring is really pulling that shaft over, and the spring is held there somewhat tenuously. The notch is obviously fairly high here. The notch is, you know, up above the level of that top plate. And it means that the failure rate with getting the front on the camera using this method is somewhat higher. It's not impossible to deal with, but you need a lot more patience. Using that bracket I used on the first method and that modified screwdriver to cock the spring, to wind the spring up, they work far more reliably, far more conveniently, and you can usually get the thing assembled on the first or second attempt. Okay, so just checking that everything's in the same position as before. That the mirror is, the capping plate is down, the mirror is in the up position, the meter drum is where we left it, the shutter is not cocked. I'll start fitting this in position. Yeah, it just dropped over the cord drum. Peel back that chrome trim, and then don't push this all the way back. You've got to depress the mirror, drop that front plate back down. Get 2 screws in the base, just as before. At the top, put 2 long screws through. You just need to get them started. It's just to make sure there's no way for those spacer washers to fall into the body, because if they do, you may not notice until you get much further down the track when one will fall somewhere you really don't want it to be. Okay, so I'm tip the camera back up, push the cam across. It felt like it dropped straight in. Checking the body here, I'll just snug that screw up lightly at the bottom, and I can tell this is sitting proud at the top here. It means it's not completely engaged. Press the shutter release, that starts that lets the mirror back up. As soon as I touch that, shut the film advance, hopefully that gear will drop in. Yeah, it just did. I just felt a little click as it dropped in. So if everything goes smoothly, this will go just like it did on the first attempt. So let's find out. Yep, we're all good. So using that method produced the same result, but it was far more of a fight tensioning that spring. But that's how you would go about doing it. That's the poor man's way of doing it. I tell you, you need a stiff pair of tweezers, and manipulating the tweezers, keeping a grip on that spring and rotating it and then hooking it in is awkward. But that little job's out of the way. I'll just replace this long screw, which was the place keeper, and put its proper screw in there. And just lightly run those in. No more than's needed to hold them in place. And we can move on with the next bit. At this stage, we should get the coupling shaft in for the meter drum and its little pinion. So I'm just going to use some molybdenum paste here to lubricate the shaft of this lightly, particularly at the tip where it goes into the drum. We've got to get that engaged with the slot in the meter drum. So I'll drop that down there. And with 2 screwdrivers, normally I just use one to provide a little bit of downward pressure and the other one to rotate that pinion until it drops in. Just checking here to make sure it hasn't dropped in already. Oh, it has. Okay, so it's already coupled up. It fell into place so easily I didn't even see it happening. Normally it's not as easy as that, but today's lucky. I'll just run a little bit of molybdenum paste through the centre of that. You could use anything you like there. Okay, so that's in place, that's down in position. The reason we put that shaft in now is because I'm going to tighten up the screws here on the front, and they're tightened to set the distance between the film plane and the lens register here. Where the lens mount register is, it's on these brass pieces, these inner pieces that are brass. That's where the lens mounts against, and the distance between those surfaces and the film plane is 47.60 millimeters, and we need to adjust that to get it right. We have 4 screws. Obviously those cupped washers that were under there, they provide a bit of spring tension, so that you are pulling this plate down against that spring tension. Means that the plate will always be nice and firm because you've got a strong spring behind it keeping it in position, but it means that you can set the position. What I have to try and achieve is making sure that my lens flange to film plane distance is the same pretty much at all 4 corners corresponding to where those screws are. Can you cheat? Yes, you can cheat a little bit. If you've got a Reflex 3 and you've got your standard lens, say, and you have got no intention of using any other lenses with the camera, you can just tighten these screws down evenly, and a good point to start would be to tighten them down until this front plate is level with the casting, and you can see the way my screwdriver catches there that that's not the case. So I tighten those screws down, and I'll do it much the same all the way around, and then check my screwdriver, and it's still sitting proud. Just come down another 1/4 turn each on those screws. It's still sitting proud. Give it another 1/4 turn. Still sitting proud. More again. That's just about level now. Okay, so that's sitting pretty much level now there. I can run my screwdriver across there without it really catching. That tells me that that's sitting fairly level, front plate sitting fairly level to the body. That is probably in too far. I think if you were to set that so it was dead level and then come back up, so 1/4 turn, loosen that 1/4 turn. There's a very high chance that you're pretty accurate with that. But if you've only got one lens with your camera, you'd leave it at that, continue closing up the front, put the lens on the camera, open the shutter on B, check the focus at the film plane, and if it all appears pretty good, all well and good, if it appears that the lens is focusing too far forward, then you would tighten the screws up, and if it looked like the lens was focusing too far back, in other words the image was converging when you were looking at an infinity target before the focus ring had reached the infinity position, then you'd loosen those screws up to bring the mount forward. But you can certainly achieve it. You could even do worse than that. You could ignore the state of this and adjust the lens to fit the body. But it's not recommended, and it's certainly not something you'd want to do if you had any intention of using alternative focal length lenses with your camera body. So I'll show you how I go about setting this up anyway. So let's just check that that still cocks and fires. That all appears good. If you wind this back too far, you will find that you may well bind up the action of the cocking and the shutter won't release correctly. Anyway, back to setting the distance accurately.